SpaceX is one step closer to launching Starship rockets from Florida's Space Coast. The Federal Aviation Administration has just released the draft environmental impact statement for Starship launches from historic Launch Complex 39A. There are loads of new details within it about SpaceX's plans for Starship in Florida, so our writers have spent the past 48 hours combing through the 410 pages of this draft, as well as the 25 different appendices that were released alongside it, and the result is the next 20 minutes of jam-packed information, so let's get started. I'm sure some of you will be wondering why on earth any of this was necessary and why it matters at all. Those are valid questions. Well, SpaceX intends to launch Starship from Florida, more specifically from the historic Launch Complex 39A. As part of that process, the company needs a launch license from the Federal Aviation Administration, better known as the FAA. So, per the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969, part of that launch license process also involves the requirement of an environmental review. Now, it's worth pointing out that this is not the first environmental review done for Starship launches at LC-39A. Those of you that may have been following along for the last several years probably remember SpaceX's first attempts at building a Starship launch pad at the site dating back all the way to 2019. This was before SpaceX even started any construction for an orbital pad at Starbase. The original site was being built next to the main ramp at LC-39A and was intended to feature a giant water-cooled flame diverter under an elevated launch mount. The end result would have likely looked somewhat similar to a blend of designs that we later saw for the two pads at Starbase, with the launch mount at a decent height from the ground like at Pad 1, while also incorporating a flame bucket like Pad 2. Back then, SpaceX and NASA went through an environmental review process which culminated in the release of a final environmental assessment for Starship at LC-39A on September 19th, 2019. At the time, NASA was the one who prepared the review rather than the FAA, and it also issued a FONSI, or Finding of No Significant Impact, for Starship operations at 39A. This was also the time period when SpaceX had set up its own temporary Starship production site at Sidco Road in Cocoa, where teams built the Mark II prototype in a competition with the Starbase teams who were building the Mark I prototype. While SpaceX did start work on the 39A Starship pad, the company stopped working on it at the beginning of 2020, and the same applied to the Mark II prototype. To this day, there remain some signs of what could have been at the launch site, with the foundations for the launch mount, as well as the circular land clearance that was done for the landing pad. SpaceX resumed work on building a Starship launch pad within 39A 2 years later, a bit further northeast of the original location, and this time they actually built an entire launch tower at the site. But again, in 2023, this work stopped before they installed any launch mount. Currently, SpaceX is well underway building out a new flame trench, tank farm, and launch mount in Florida while using the existing launch tower built in 2022. So, if SpaceX already had gone through all of the environmental approvals and reviews, why did they need to do a new one? Well, as you might have guessed from the little summary of the last 6 years of Starship at the Kennedy Space Center, the launch site design for Starship has changed quite a lot since the original design. Starship itself has also changed dramatically since 2019, and is expected to be upgraded quite substantially over the next several years. Furthermore, SpaceX requested a higher launch cadence from Launch Complex 39A than what was studied in the 2019 environmental assessment. All of these changes combined is what prompted the FAA to initiate this entire process, but thankfully it's a process that is close to completion. You see, this process had actually started last year, with the FAA releasing a Notice of Intent to carry out this Environmental Impact Statement, also known as an EIS, in May 2024. Following that, there was a 45-day scoping period where the agency took comments from the general public to incorporate in their review. Once the scoping period ended, the agency, alongside SpaceX, started the review process. This also included consultation with federal agencies such as the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Department of Transportation. This is quite a lengthy process, but once finished, the FAA then releases a draft of the EIS, and that's exactly what this video is about. Doing all of these studies and reviews and consultations is the part that often takes the longest, so the worst part of this paperwork is now out of the way, but there's still a bit more to wait. Now that the draft EIS has been released, there is once again a 45-day public comment period in which the public will be able to give their own comments about the project and what was found during the environmental process as described in the draft EIS. The FAA will then review those comments and may take them for consideration, perhaps performing further review and consultation work with other agencies or with SpaceX. This is the part that can make the whole process take even longer, but generally, if the initial review process was good enough, the comments are taken for consideration, but may not really kickstart any more reviews, sort of like, yeah, we read your comments and we're happy for you. Once all of that is completed, then the FAA will release the final EIS and hopefully a FONSI alongside it. That will clear the project from the environmental side of things. If all goes well, those should come out hopefully before the end of this year. While it surely is a lengthy process, it's probably worth pointing out that the pad is still in no condition to host a launch, and it's probably not going to be used until the middle of next year. While it is a hassle to go through this paperwork, it doesn't seem like it's going to be the long pole to getting Starship launches from Florida. Things have changed since 2019, but what exactly has changed? Well, even saying a lot would be quite the understatement. Let's start with the launch cadence, because in the 2019 environmental assessment, SpaceX was asking for 24 launches per year, while in this latest EIS, the cadence requested is 44 launches per year. That's nearly double the cadence. The EIS also considers that at least up to half of the launches might be during the night, while the previous review only considered 20% of the launches, 5 launches per year being at nighttime. Another even bigger change compared to 2019 is rocket catches. That's right, the previous environmental review had occurred so long ago that it didn't even consider the booster returning to the launch tower. As for the ship, it only considered it landing at Landing Zone 1 at the Cape, with a potential future revision considering landings at a landing zone within Launch Complex 39A. In this new EIS, however, things are now very different, because it now considers that both stages could be making a return to the launch site for each launch. This means it considers up to 44 launches per year and up to 88 landings per year. The increase in launches and landings also means that this EIS considers a larger number of pre-launch tests than before. The rocket itself also has changed quite a bit, and it's also expected to change even more in the future. While on the 2019 review, SpaceX considered a Starship with about 5,000 metric tons of propellant and a liftoff thrust of 62 meganewtons, which by the way is a lighter and less powerful Starship than the current one, this EIS considers a Starship that is up to 150 meters tall, holds 6,750 metric tons of propellant, and produces a liftoff thrust of 103 meganewtons. That kind of Starship hasn't been built yet, let alone flown yet, but SpaceX intends to do so in the future, so this EIS already covers the future iterations and clears SpaceX from having to redo a lot of these reviews when they want to start flying them. The launch pad design has also changed since 2019. As we've already seen, SpaceX is building a flame trench with a bifurcated diverter, and they are completely remodeling the tank farm compared to what was studied in 2019. Back in that older review, the plan was to share the Starship tank farm with the Falcon tank farm for liquid oxygen and nitrogen, while the old hydrogen sphere at 39A used for Saturn and Shuttle would be turned into a methane storage tank for Starship. This is something that SpaceX threw out of the window rather quickly. Even when they were building the launch tower and old-style launch mount back in 2022, the company had already begun building a separate dedicated tank farm for Starship. Since 2019, SpaceX has also upgraded the Falcon side of the pad with a better and improved liquid oxygen storage and chill-down capacity, as well as a new location for the RP-1 tank farm located to the west of the main ramp. This also means that the entirety of the east side of the complex can be solely dedicated to Starship, and here's where a new change comes into play: a catch tower. That's right, SpaceX will be building a dedicated catch tower. Now, this is not super surprising because the FAA already announced this last year when the Notice of Intent came out, but with the Draft EIS now out, we know a few more details about it. For example, in the document, we finally get a concise and official explanation as to why SpaceX needs a separate catch tower, saying, quote, "While the integration tower used for launch could support super heavy landings, an additional landing tower would reduce launch pad refurbishment needed between each launch, providing a shorter turnaround period between launches and increase the efficiency of launch operations." The document also explains the tower would be 480 feet tall, that's 146 meters, which indicates it would still be the same height as the current launch tower design. The catch tower would be located at the site of the old landing zone for Starship that was constructed in 2019. Remember when the booster and the ship were supposed to land on landing legs instead of landing on robotic arms? How antiquated is that, landing on landing legs? God, that's so 2020. Something else that is interesting to note from the draft EIS is that the map included of the proposed infrastructure at 39A doesn't seem to match up with what SpaceX is already actually constructing at the pad for Starship. For example, it shows the methane tank farm much closer to the pad than where it is actually being built. It also shows the liquid oxygen tank farm as being located directly behind the tower alongside the water tank farm, but right now it seems like all of the storage tanks will be to the north of the tower. While the Draft EIS includes landings of both stages back at the launch site, it also contemplates the possibility that either one or both stages land at sea, either because they'll be recovered on some floating platform or because they'll be expended. The option to be recovered on a floating platform is not something to be super duper excited about, because this is something that SpaceX has included in pretty much every Starship environmental assessment, including the one from 2019 for 39A. It's the same deal as when it considers a larger and more powerful variant of Starship. It covers a potential scenario that may happen in the future, perhaps, even though SpaceX may not have any immediate plans to carry it out. That is, don't go crazy looking for a potential Starship C landing platform, at least for now. The expendable landings also cover the cases where SpaceX may want to expend either the booster and or the ship. While Starship is meant to be fully reusable, there may be cases where expending one or both stages could be valuable. Such cases are, for example, carrying out experimental landings like we're seeing now with the ship, or as we saw recently with Booster 14's second flight. You never know when you may need this capability, so good on SpaceX for including it. Another big change compared to the 2019 review is the addition of the launch operations of propellant generation on site. In particular, SpaceX wants to have its own air separation unit, which would take air from the atmosphere and distill it into oxygen and nitrogen, which would then be turned into liquids for use during Starship operations. Separately, SpaceX would also build and operate a natural gas pre-treatment facility that would take in natural gas delivered by a supplier and purify it for use by Starship, including of course as a fuel for the rocket. That facility would include not only the purification plant, but it also includes a methane liquefier that would turn the methane into a liquid for easier storage and loading into Starship. Since the new launch pad design uses a lot more water than the one previously analysed, SpaceX is also proposing to build retention ponds at 39A. Some of those have already been built, in fact, with one appearing to the west of the main ramp over the last few months near the liquid oxygen tank farm for Falcon. Apart from the air separation unit, the natural gas pre-treatment facility, and the methane liquefier, SpaceX would install 12 Tesla megapacks on site to provide a continuous power supply to the pad and the additional facilities. In the long list of changes since 2019, there's also the matter of Starship production. As we've already covered here at NSF, SpaceX plans to eventually build a Starship manufacturing facility in Florida, and while it is already under construction, it will take a long time to finish and outfit it with the required tooling and staff. So initially, SpaceX will build the vehicles at Starbase in Texas and barge them over to Florida. According to the Draft EIS, these vehicles would then be transported over to the KSC turn basin next to NASA's Vehicle Assembly Building, and then moved over to Launch Complex 39A for test and launch operations. Isn't it so convenient that we have multiple robotic cameras operating 24 hours a day right next to the turn basin? I wonder if we'll see anything on Space Coast Live. If this is supposed to be a study about the environmental impact of the project, then what does the EIS have to say about all of that? Well, there's a lot to unpack. Then again, I did say in the intro this has 410 pages and 25 appendices, so of course there's a lot to unpack. First, let's talk about the infrastructure, because all of those fancy new additions would really have quite an impact. First and foremost is the fact that, at least according to the document, the air separation unit and natural gas pre-treatment facility wouldn't be built right away. This means that for the initial launches, SpaceX would need to truck in the propellant until those facilities are built and active. Within the Draft EIS, the analysis considers that for every launch, up to 270 trucks would be needed for liquid oxygen, 80 for liquid nitrogen, and 90 for liquid methane. In total, that's up to 440 trucks that would be needed per launch, which would, in turn, necessitate nearly 20,000 trucks carrying all the commodities used at the launch site. That's a considerable number of trucks that would result in increased traffic at the Kennedy Space Center and could be impacted by delays due to road closures for other launches, along with numerous other side effects. Once these facilities are constructed, it's not like they're going to be harmless to the environment. These are not going to be teeny tiny facilities. They will be large-scale facilities and will require land and resources that are not currently available. For example, the air separation unit will be 55 meters tall and could take up more than 222,000 1,000 square feet of space. That's nearly 21,000 square meters. These facilities will also require the delivery of commodities such as water for thermal transfers and of course the natural gas that will be purified. According to the document, the water may be supplied via trucks or a pipeline. As for the natural gas, SpaceX would utilize an existing multi-user pipeline at the KSC, and in the future, Florida City Gas may provide an additional delivery pipeline to supply the site. There'll also be waste generated as a result of their operations which would need to be properly taken care of. For instance, the natural gas pre-treatment system would purify the natural gas and extract methane from it, but that also means that impurities such as mercury, sulfur, water, carbon dioxide and other heavy hydrocarbons would remain as waste. The methane liquefier and the air separation unit would also use water during their operations, which would also result in wastewater generated as a result of their operations, something that SpaceX will also need to handle according to regulations. SpaceX and wastewater, where have I heard that one before? Then there is of course the operation of the deluge system at the pad, which uses a lot more water than the current setup at Pad 1 at Starbase. The Draft EIS estimates that up to 400,000 gallons, about 1.5 million litres of water would be used each launch, with an additional 68,000 gallons, about 250,000 litres, would be used for each landing. This means that when accounting for the maximum number of activities at the site, such as static fires, launches and landings, SpaceX would need up to 50 million gallons or 190 million litres of water every year. That is 457 average American homes worth of yearly water consumption. And this is water that is expected to be mostly vaporized when the engines are running, with the document citing that approximately 92% of the deluge water would be vaporized during the operations. That said, the tiny bit that is retained at the deluge ponds would be reused as much as possible, and if not, it would then have to be dealt with and treated. Now for launch operations. There are of course a few things to consider, one of them being the rocket emissions. During a launch or static fire test, Starship is expected to emit pollutants such as carbon monoxide as well as various nitrogen oxides. While the increase in launch and landing operations would mean a higher emission of such pollutants, the total emissions in a worst case scenario would still be under the national ambient air quality standards except for the release of nitrogen oxides. While some of these impacts can be mitigated, in the case of the nitrogen oxides, the analysis states that the overall reasons for the large quantities of this material being discharged in the air is due to the increase in launch cadence. Launches will also be quite noisy, and the landings will produce audible sonic booms. The study of launch and landing sounds and their impact on the population is really complicated, and there are multiple ways to analyze this. As part of the EIS, SpaceX contracted a company that specializes in these kinds of studies, so it could look at the impacts of Starship activities as established in this EIS. The sound analysis study examined that the impact of the sound emitted not only during the launches as proposed in the EIS, but also considered various scenarios. For instance, it assessed the noise currently generated from all activities at the Cape, serving as a baseline for the noise effects at the site. It also estimated the noise anticipated from future activities at the Cape, given the new rockets that are expected to launch soon from the Space Coast. The study also examined the noise impact of Starship from 39A separately, and then compared the two baseline noise levels, current and future, with Starship from 39A and combined them. The study also incorporates the impacts from the proposed Starship operations from Space Launch Complex 37 at the Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. It goes a step further and also analyzes the sound impacts depending on the weather, season, and launch and landing trajectories. They looked into every little detail, and what's the result? Well, to the surprise of absolutely no one, Starship will be quite noisy. The baseline levels of noise will increase quite a lot at the Cape when Starship flies from both LC-39A and Slick-37, alongside all the other rockets set to launch from all the other launch pads. Starship's re-entry from orbit will also generate a sonic boom, which will be audible across all of central Florida, although the places closer to LC-39A will hear a louder sonic boom compared to those further away, of course. Since the Draft EIS considers the potential for expending boosters and ships, it obviously goes into excruciating detail as to what could happen to marine life at each and every one of the potential splashdown locations for both the booster and the ship. The booster would only splash down off the coast of Florida in the Atlantic, but since the ship could go to orbit, it could potentially splash down in many different places around the world. Of course, studying the impacts is one thing and preventing them is another. For this, SpaceX is implementing specific preventative measures. For instance, certain areas with protected marine life, such as the Indian Ocean splashdown area, have designated avoidance zones that the ship would not target to minimize the risk of impact on endangered species. Perhaps some of the largest impacts of Starship activity at 39A will have less to do with the environment, but rather with other humans. For example, every single launch will necessitate the ground closure of a large area of the Space Coast. This map illustrates the restricted areas for launch and landing, as well as for pre-launch testing. The red area includes LC-39B, as well as ULA's Slick 41, and the yellow area extends as far north as Playa Linda Beach and as far south as SpaceX's Slick 40. We are very lucky that the yellow area does not reach the KSC press site by just a few hundred meters, because that's where we and the rest of the media cover launches from. But this means that a lot of people will be affected by each major activity at 39A with Starship, so I reckon not many people will be pleased. At least there is one positive aspect. As Starship flies more frequently and its reliability improves, these restricted areas would likely be reduced in size, and perhaps some of these impacts will be minimized. Perhaps Starship operations at Launch Complex 39A, as proposed, might have some impact, but nothing that careful planning and diligent management couldn't address. However, it's crucial to consider these operations as part of the broader Starship program. It's not solely about 39A, but also includes Space Launch Complex 37 and, naturally, Starbase. Once all the documentation is finalized, SpaceX would be permitted to launch Starship up to 145 times per year across all of its sites. There would be 5 launch pads for Starship, as well as 3 different catch towers, which means there will be probably a constant build of new tower sections and parts in the near future. We talked earlier about SpaceX's plans for an air separation unit at 39A, but that's also in the plans for Slick 37, and SpaceX is already beginning work for the air separation unit that will be supplying Starbase. Slick 37 will also have its own natural gas pre-treatment system and methane liquefier. Every site will need to have its own supplies, its own construction, maintenance, and operations teams. There's also, as mentioned earlier, Starship production and transport, both at the Kennedy Space Center and Starbase. The sheer amount of work that will be needed to carry out all of this proposed infrastructure and then operate the program as a whole, it's going to be unprecedented. All of this is going to allow SpaceX to utilize Starship for the numerous projects it is involved in, which includes NASA's Artemis program with the first landing of astronauts on the lunar surface since 1972, the deployment of SpaceX's largest Starlink V3 satellites, and the company's own Mars ambitions. So yeah, it turns out this paperwork is important after all. It's one of the many little steps towards Starship's ambitious future, and we'll be there covering it all. I've been Ryan Caton for NSF, thanks for watching, and goodbye.